We have a very interesting topic, water. So interesting, in fact, that a lot of the people who were invited to the platform just simply couldn't come because it's too sensitive a subject for some of them. When I was first asked to chair this, I was very afraid of what might happen. But I think I've a relatively tame set of speakers here, although we wouldn't presume anything with the three of them. They're highly experienced individuals. I'll just briefly describe the three of them. I'm sure many of you know all three, maybe two or one of them. First of all, I should introduce myself. My name is PJ Rudden. I happen to be the president of the UCD Engineering Graduates Association, and I suppose that's the reason maybe why I was asked to chair this. We have three speakers, starting with Damien Owens. Damien is the Registrar of Engineers Ireland. Damien's a very experienced engineer. If you want to know what the Registrar does, well, he accredits the third level courses in UCD and other colleges. So, I mean, the colleges, we know, are very wary of Damien. When he comes around on his, he's like the school inspector coming around every 3 or 4 years to accredit or not, because a course that is not accredited nowadays, I can assure you, and a course in this country that isn't accredited by Engineers Ireland simply will not be, will not flourish and will not be engaged with. Michael Phillips is also very well known. Michael is recently retired as the Dublin City Engineer and as Director of Traffic. Michael is also a long-standing water engineer with a lot of experience from both the public and private sector. He's also an expert in roads and bridges. In fact, there's not much that Michael is not an expert in, I can assure you. And he has, I suppose, this is true about all the speakers, but particularly about Michael. He also had responsibility in Dublin City Council for environmental matters. So, as indeed has Micheál in terms of his professorship, but you know, I think the whole area of engineering and environment has to blend together to make it workable. Micheál Bruen is Professor of Hydrology, Director in UCD. He's Director of the Duge Centre for Water Resources, and quite an expert on the whole issue of water resources, climate change, flooding, and we were very privileged to have him early in the year at our spring panel discussion on flooding. So I will ask Damien to start. He'll be immediately followed by Michael, and he will be immediately followed by Micheál, and then we'll have a Q&A session. But we have an hour in which to indulge ourselves. So thank you very much.
Thank you, PJ, for the introduction. You make me sound like the speed cops for third level, the traffic cops. So for anybody who's not a civil engineer, don't worry, neither am I, but you're in good hands today. I'm going to keep the presentation fairly general. There won't be too much formulas or large figures, anything like that, okay? So really what I want to talk to you for the next 15 minutes or so is to look at water from a different perspective and how we think about water and perhaps how we think about water. So that may sound a bit contrived. Our relationship with water is very complex and it's full of paradoxes. And here's an interesting paradox from the 18th century. For want of water, we drank water. If we had had water, we should have drank wine. And it's really what this paradox gets to us is the perspective. Like any riddle, it's the perspective of who's giving the riddle. And the perspective of the authors of this riddle are sailors in a boat, say in Dublin Bay, and they're waiting to come ashore, and they're waiting on the tide. So for want of water, in other words the tide, they drink water. If they had water, if they had the tide, of course the boat would have come ashore and they could have drank wine. So there's the perspective that they're giving. And this perspective is, our relationship with water very much depends on our perspective and where we are. As a developed society, as a first world society, we can become very complacent as how we view water. and how we interact with it. We just take it for granted. We turn on the tap, it appears. If you cast your mind back to the Celtic boom, I remember going into Superquin, for those that can remember Superquin, going into Superquin one day, and there was a bottle of water in a little sort of glass safe, and it was security tagged, and it was about €70 for that bottle of water. And such were the heady days of the Celtic Tiger. Well, I've news for you, it's a ride back again. This is a hotel in Belfast that is selling water at about €30 for a bottle. And not only that, they have 2 waiters who will choose the correct water that will suit the palate to go with your meal. So we're getting back there. But that water is still cheap. You can still, get bottles of water for €400 or €500. You can spend €400 on a bottle of desalinated water. But it's not just any desalinated water. It comes from 2,000 feet down beside some Pacific island. Okay, so somebody gets water 2,000 feet out and desalinates it, and they'll sell it to you for about €400 a bottle. I'm sure it tastes very, very good. You can also buy a bottle of water that's from the middle of a glacier. But at the end of the day, it's still water. And we complain about water. We had a big debate about water charges, but at the end of the day, if you go into the supermarket, you're still paying more for water than you are for petrol. And perhaps we should start drinking petrol. I wouldn't really advise that. These people have obviously taken this on board, and you may see some people around the campus today in the festival drinking petrol, and so be it. But could you imagine the carbon footprint if we all started doing something like that? Well, we think a lot about our carbon footprint, but do we ever stop and think for a moment about our water footprint? So I got up this morning, and the first thing I did was have a shower. Average shower is about 65 litres of water. Doesn't sound like a lot, but that's probably the average person's weight. So every time you have a shower, your own body weight of water is coming in the top, and a few seconds later, going out the bottom of the shower. So it's quite a lot of water when you put it in that context. I then had a latte. Now, to be honest, the cup was really only that big. So it was a mug of latte, not 200 litres. But when you do the water footprint of growing the sugar, growing the coffee beans, transporting it, growing the grass to feed the cow, and the cow that gives you the milk, and process the milk to go in the latte, you end up with a figure somewhere in and around 200 litres of water for that 1 cup of latte. So I was feeling, quite heavy carrying all this water footprint with me at this stage. So the next thing anyway, I decided to get dressed. So I put on my jeans, 8,000 litres of water. A kilo of cotton takes about 101 gallons or 500 litres of water to produce a kilo of cotton. So my jeans, they are nice jeans. They're 8,000 litres of water, and what amazes me, with 8,000 litres of water, they're still dry. And I think that's a great engineering achievement. And we put on the t-shirt, so hey, I was dressed. So before I even left the house this morning, I had basically, somehow or other, managed to have a water footprint of 10,000 litres, or 10 tonnes. So obviously I couldn't carry all that 10 tonnes myself, so I went to my car, and there was another 180 tonnes of water to make that car, which if you work it out over a 10-year life of the car and the average mileage, for every kilometre you drive that car, you're using about 1.5 litres of water. The petrol, you might think, okay, it's petrol. Each litre of petrol we consume takes about 1.5 to 2 litres of water to produce. I was thirsty after all this, so I had a bottle of water. Something like this. So it's half a litre of water in here, but it takes 1.5 litres of water to make a bottle. You're going to use once, you're going to chuck away. Okay? So the footprint's getting bigger. So we decided not to have water, we're going to have a glass of beer. Well, beer isn't much better. Beer takes about 5 litres to produce your pint of beer, because you have to grow the grain and do all the processing. And lastly, our mobile phone. Did you ever think that you might be carrying a ton of water around in your pocket for your mobile phone? And this is all very good. This is the footprint. And this is my footprint, and we're only here at lunchtime, I haven't eaten nothing yet. This is our typical footprint for one person for a day, or part of a day. So what happens when you multiply that by millions and millions of people? So how did society get to where we are today to support all this water? So let's look back in history, and we'll look at some people who really were pretty good at providing water in volume. So good manufacturers of water. So what did the Romans ever do for us? People who've seen the film Life of Brian will know that famous phrase. And apart from giving us water and sanitation and health, what did he ever do for us? Well, let's look at Italy. Rome is on the west coast of the Apennine Range. Lovely climate, nice warm place, good place to live, especially back around the turn of 2,000 years ago. However, as the city grew, they need more water. The problem is that the rain falls on the other side of the mountain range, on the eastern side of the Apennines. So the Romans had to figure out some way, if this city is going to grow, if this city is going to prosper, we're going to have to get the water from those mountains to our city. So they took a long-term view, a strategic view, and built a series of aqueducts. And this aqueduct is I think the Anio Nuvius aqueduct. It's about 80 kilometres long and was built in the 1st century AD. It took 14 years to build, so it was a fairly long-term project. And if you look at the way Rome was ruled at the time, it has 2 consuls whose term of office was a year. So they were starting things that were not going to finish for very many years. So it was a very long-term perspective to delivering water, but they recognised the value of it and why they needed it. So they built a series of aqueducts, not just around Rome, they also built them in other parts of the Roman Empire. Some of the aqueducts were nearly 200 miles long, so they're fairly good at constructing these. They had lots of good engineers to build them, obviously. And in the 1st century, so once these aqueducts came in, the population of Rome increased from 600,000 to 1 million people in the space of 100 years. Okay? So at the end of that century, Rome was 1 million people. The world population at the time was 300 million. 100 million, or 1 million were in Rome and being served by all this water. So if you put that in today's population, it's about 25 million, about the population of Shanghai. Okay, so that was the engineering challenge they had, was providing the water to a city of that size using that technology. But it's a bit more complicated than that. Here we have the Colosseum, and you might think it looks in bad shape, but believe it or not, it was in pretty good shape until about the 14th century. And if you look at the way the Romans looked at public projects, and anybody who's a building contractor here might want to cover their ears. Long-term projects such as the Colosseum, the contractor got paid half the money when the building went up, and the other half usually after a long period of time, like 25 or 40 years. In the case of the Colosseum, it was 40 years. Okay, so what it meant was that the second payment, or the remainder of the payment for the project, was really for your pension, or was for your grandchildren, but certainly you didn't have it in real time. But that's the way they funded projects, and it meant they could fund the projects from future wars, basically. So the long-term perspective again coming in there. The other thing about the Colosseum is that there was water, there was piped water on the top floor. And it's provided from a reservoir on the Palatine Hill across the way, which gave it a head to get up onto the top floor. And as you probably know, they used to flood the playing surface and have naval battles there. So that's how they got the water anyway into the city. After that then they distributed in lead pipes. And lead pipes get a bit of a bad press during the Roman era because they were blamed from an academic piece of work in the early 80s for the downfall of the Roman Empire. Not quite true. They consumed leads in lots of other ways rather than just the pipes. They did various ways of making concoctions of wine and honey in lead pots, which wasn't really very healthy. So the lead pipes brought the water, obviously, distributed around the city to the various villas and large buildings, but also into public spaces. So even today, if you go to Rome, you can put your cup in any fountain and any water. That water is actually potable. You can drink it. It's clean, and you see people doing it. I wouldn't advise it in the Trevi fountain. There's lots of other stuff in there besides water, but by and large, even today, you can drink the water anywhere in Rome. And in Piazza Navona, up until the Renaissance, used to block off the streets, block the fountains, and allow the water to overflow to cool down the population. The Vatican took a dim view of this, of people, jumping into this big, basically swimming pool, and that practice was stopped. So the lead pipes, again, were a good way of distributing the water around the city. Again, lots of planning, lots of engineering. If you put it in the Irish context, lead pipes came here probably around the 12th century, 12th, 13th century, I think is the earliest lead pipe in Dublin. I was looking in Peter Summerville-Large's book about Dublin, and he speaks of the first pipe in Dublin was from Mullinahack, which is around Thomas Street, back of Thomas Street, Mullinahack to the monastery over in Oxman Town, so it went across the river. And when it got there, the pipe was the width of a goose's quill. So you can imagine how much water was in that pipe. But what was even worse, it came from a place called Mullinahack, and for any Irish scholars, Mullinahack means basically the dirty mill, and that's been kind. So if you want water from a dirty mill on a pipe that wide, that's where Dublin was in medieval times. So the Roman Empire at this stage was long in decline, and infrastructure wasn't great for the next few hundred years. To the extent that there were lots of swamps and dirty swamps around the city, and malaria outbreaks were fairly common. This guy is not Santa Claus, he is Pope Urban VIII, and he had the misfortune of contracting malaria. However, he was lucky he survived. The Curia and the conclave that voted him in as Pope weren't too lucky. Many of them passed away. So Pope Urban sent the Jesuits off to find a cure for malaria. And they went off to Peru and found quinine. The quinine was very, very bitter and very difficult it wasn't very palatable. And thanks to a Swiss clockmaker called Jacob Schweppes, he came up with a tonic which made it much nicer. So, indirectly we can help blame the Romans for giving us some perhaps gin and tonic. So really, if we take the long-term perspective then, and compare where we are today with where the Romans were, in terms of water supply, they recognized the need. They needed lots of water to keep their civilization and their city alive. And they built these pipes to bring it across the country. In Dublin, our water supply, can be on a knife edge. We had a situation a few years ago when there was a big freeze and pipes burst, and the water supply was on a knife edge. We can bring water across the country, and it is a topical debate. Should we build a pipe to the Shannon? In my view, we already have two pipes. They're called the Grand Canal and the Royal Canal, so hey, I have no problem with a third one. Lead pipes, the Romans had, got bad press, but they had their lead pipes around the city. We currently have about 70,000 lead pipes around Dublin, and the associated are there health issues with those. So that's another way of looking at it. And contamination, that led to the malarial outbreaks around Rome at the time. Equally, not far from here, we're probably pumping raw sewage somewhere into the sea. So have we really progressed in those 2,000 years? And that's really the question I would throw out. The Romans did a lot of work cleaning up the water, distributing it. As a first world society, we take it for granted. We've got to take a longer term view. We've got to invest in our infrastructure. We've got to invest in the engineers to deliver that infrastructure. So the real paradox then is we know the value of water, but somehow our minds, our perception and how we actually think about water doesn't really want us to go there. And we really need to take the longer view. So it's not really, what can the Romans do for us? What can we do for ourselves? Thank you.
When I was working, I had been city engineer and director of traffic. I used to tell people that there was, every day I had 3 rush hours in the morning and 3 rush hours in the evening, and they could never understand it. And part of it is that when you get up in the morning, the first thing you do is put on the kettle. That meant that you had to have a water supply for 1.5 million people. The next thing you did was you turned around and you flushed the toilet. It meant we had to take away water from 1.5 million people. So when you came to Donnybrook in the morning, you had 2 rush hours under the road and you had 1 rush hour on the traffic. And I can tell you, if I could have fitted the people into the pipes, it would have been life would have been a hell of a lot easier, because we never had any fallback, you know. But it just gives you an idea of the way we accept things in life and times. And also, the one thing that you learn with water, actually, as well as, and it's the thing about humans, is that our memory spell, it's how we survive. We tend to shut down an awful lot of things we don't want to think about, and once you go over a 10-year spell, in actual fact, you do forget the details. So when subjected, I had that experience with people who had floods, that 10 years later, when there was an event which avoided a flood in an area, and you told them and explained to them exactly, read the report of the previous 10 years when it had happened, it was amazing. They'd all forgotten that it was that bad. Now, they knew there was a flood, they knew their house, but they had forgotten the detail and the extent very often. So it is. But just to give you an idea, what we my one, I suppose, is looking at the big picture, how it affects each of us here in this room, you know, after Damien's talk. But when you look at the water cycle, everybody's aware of the water cycle. But when you think of water, it's odorless, it's transparent, and it's picked up from the sea. It saves lives, and it takes lives. It creates physical feature, it generates electricity, you know, the power in it, and the energy in it. And yet at the same time it creates physical features like the Grand Canyon. And these are the scale and extent of water that you can see. And what so few people actually realize, and this is when people are down on the west coast when there's a storm there, and it really annoys me at times, is that if you actually stand there and I say to you, you have a height about that height of water, what does it weigh? That's a ton of water. And so few people actually realize that. It's only when you live on the west coast and you're a good swimmer and you realize the power of it. But here as well then, when you look at the cycle, the water's taken up. About 60% of that water is lost before it ever reaches the shore or land. It just falls as rain. But it also, that water picks up good and bad things from the stratosphere when it's up there, then it falls on the land, and then it actually picks up good and bad while it flows back into the sea. Then it picks up the characteristics as well from the rocks that it's flowing over down along. So that means that in actual fact, when you begin to think about it in detail, there's very few of the major water supplies that you will find that are actually exactly the same. You know, everybody's water supply is different because it picks up the different characteristics, so it does. So the other part then is that here we have the map of Dublin, the medieval time. And when the Danes came ashore here, the one thing that they came was, the one thing that made them park there was the water supply. And this is what so few people actually appreciate is, water supply is the whole reason why a town or a settlement actually exists in a location. And it's also the reason why a town or a settlement dies, because the water dried up or it became so polluted. So it did. Now, okay, the economy and the business life will carry on, but unless you have a water supply and a viable water supply to give to people, that town will not really survive. People will move on because it gets too expensive. So it does. So then you begin to look at, well, when you look at Dublin and that, you sort of say, what is the water supply? What population are we feeding, and where does it come from? So nowadays, because of the distances and everything, we begin to look at the greater Dublin region. So it has moved out from being the Blackpool in the River Liffey, right out now to including parts of Kildare, Wicklow, and Meath. So it does. And this is the way you have to begin to think about, what exactly is it, so that you as an individual who lived in Meath or Kildare or whatever it is, and were used to your own sort of nobody interfering with anything around you, that day and age is fast disappearing, because now you're becoming part of a larger community and you have to begin to fit in. And this has been developed through generations out in the likes of China and all that. But here in Ireland, because we lived on the edge of Europe, we were not overrun by armies, but similarly we were a low populated country. And so we got used to having probably our our own space, so it is. And then you begin to look at here the population, of the forecasts, and you begin to see the population, sharply increase from over here to under 1 million up to here, heading up at 2.25 million. And you've got to say, how do we actually do the infrastructure for that type of thing? How do we plan? How do we build in flexibility? How do you know that those figures are exact? Because, and then if you could also look at Ireland and say, right into the future, what's happening? And this would be one of the plans that has been produced, that along the east coast that you actually develop a corridor for a population of 5 million along the way. And that would be mainly a Dublin-Belfast corridor, so it would. Then along the west coast, develop a corridor there for 3 million, take mainly Cork to Galway. Now, okay, on the next report, I think it'll include, because the regional thing will be Waterford. But if you take it just in your own head, because the industries are in Galway, Limerick and Cork there at the moment, how do you develop that area along there? And then use the rest of the country, the infrastructure in the rest of the country to feed into those areas. And that is maybe the way that we have to start thinking, because as well, when you begin to think of, we're not local anymore, it's global. What's happening in the EU? The city region concept is there. The Barcelonas, the Madrids, the Copenhagens, these are the people who are now going into the EU, these regions, to negotiate with the EU. Okay, you'll see ministers for the national government there, but the regions is an extremely powerful lobby, so it is. And then you have to look back in history and say, well, what did happen, with populations? And you can look here at there's 1,200, and that went down to 8,000. Sorry, 12,000 went down to 8,000. Say there with the Black Plague. And there was a couple of visits of the Black Plague even before that. And then you had Cromwell that came ashore here, and you can see what he did in scattering the population, So, and yet I suppose in another way you look at Syria today and you see that happening. You say, well, what's going to happen us today, into the future? Because you have to context what's happening over there, could it happen here into the future and that. And then you begin to look at this figure here. What happened here? Well, some of you might remember that 1730 was the famous Arctic winter, where about 300,000 people died. And the winter carried over for about 18 months. Due to what they I think was a volcano maybe in the Pacific. The sun didn't arise. They had, initially started off with barbecues on the Liffey, which was just lovely, because the Liffey was frozen over and everything like that. But when the potatoes that had been put into the pits for storage over the winter failed, and then the seeds didn't grow because the sun never came out, and at the same time we were exporting the coal from, just like the wheat and the other famine, from Ireland to England. There was about 300,000 people migrated to the urban area, and that's how you came. So it gives you an idea that you have to look at the world context and flexibility, and at the same time build in a flexibility where you keep an open mind. So then you look at ourselves here, and you look at sort of the existing situation. I suppose the main pipe supplies are into the urbans and the towns, and then you have the group water schemes that are single, and what we're looking at there, or what Irish Water have been doing, is that you combine them into larger ones, because with the EU legislation and that, people should expect a certain minimum standard. And if you look at the group water schemes back in the 70s or early 80s, we were lucky actually that an awful lot more people didn't die of maybe the disease, because the standards just weren't there. The people in the village were just delighted. First of all, they wanted to get water to the cattle, then the water to the houses and everything like that. So you begin to look at that, and then you have the private wells, and you start to say, well, private wells are they really that relevant? And they are, because there's over 200,000 wells, of which about maybe 50% pollute the groundwater, because the septic tanks are not the proper septic tanks, or they're not in the pollution, they're too close to sources and things like that. And the problem with Ireland is our aquifers are what we call young water. It means that it's very easy to get access to the aquifer and do that, but it means that also they can be polluted, and then the pollution stays there for long periods. So about 80% of the water supplied or used today is about surface water, either through reservoirs, dams and rivers, and then you have 20% of that, and we have no desalination to date, so we don't. But like for the average person who lives their life, this is what you want. The environment, you look at the economy, then the social life, the urban forum, how good is our city? Do we want public open spaces? The movement through that area, the environment, the clean environment, and then the culture, of course. And in each of those locations, you'd like to have a bottle of water or have access to a tap or a toilet so you can flush. So you can see the water is hidden in the background. It's not up there in the front. What will be up there, as you can see, is movement, traffic, because you'll be fully aware of it, so you will. So that's a thing that directly affects your everything. But the water is in the subconscious, and you only really notice it when it's not there. So in the Dublin region, the first major high pressure water supply, water was in the Dublin region coming since the year 1000 from the River Poddle and then the Dodder and stuff like that. But this reservoir in 1870 was really the major one because it took water. The canal companies were playing ducks and drakes at the time as well. Like, you think that modern day, you have capitalists in this, but if you ever wanted to know a capitalist, it was the canal owners. They promised water. So when a bill was brought to Westminster to, say, build a reservoir, the canal companies fought it tooth and nail and said, we'll supply the water. The minute the bill failed, they then said, well, we haven't got enough water unless you pay us double the price, and that type of thing. So you had this blackmail going on all the time. And that's why there's a statue to the guy in O'Connell Street, one of the guys that actually, John Gray, who actually fought it tooth and nail to get in there. But that one was built in 1870, and okay, there's 2 dams. The second one was built in 1923, but that was again building in the flexibility that there was expansion there. So it was. These guys knew their stuff, and the Vartry River there is dammed. Then we had Bornabrina up here, and Bornabrina, this one supplies about 13% of our present-day capacity, which gives you an idea of its size today. But in those days, it was a major thing. And the pipe takes deviations, and it just shows how things happen. As an engineer looking at it, I couldn't figure out at times, why did the pipe go in that direction? Of course, what you realised when you look back was the pipe was now going through a landowners who had a vote in Westminster. So the pipe would sometimes take a little deviation to make sure that his estate here in Ireland had a water supply. So nothing has ever changed. It just changes a slight bit in the colour. So life still goes on. So then you had Bornabrina because of the townships of Rathmines and Pembroke. They refused to be part of the city, the Dublin City. They just didn't mix with those sort of people, so they didn't. And so the city was taken in then. That was taken in about 1940, but it's small. But then you have the big one, Paula Foucault, Ballymore Eustace is the treatment works, and that supplies about 55% of the water at the moment. And that really has reached capacity, so it has. And then Leixlip was built as the other side of the river, Liffey, in about 1966. And the characteristics of both those waters are totally different, even though they're the same river, because of the limestone that the water flows over in Kildare, so it does. So how do you then develop a strategy for a water supply? So the thing about it is you think yourself, say, well, we'll just work it out, and say, where do we want to go? But you don't. You have all these other different things to take into consideration, that of the things. And then you have the Eastern River Basin Management. You have the stormwater policies and all that have now got to be taken. Then you have the EU legislation, and that. So you have. So you have to take all these, and society has now got so complex with, the amenity issues about boating, sailing, fishing, all that, and some people would say that's far more important than, the making sure you have a water supply. So then you then begin to look at, once upon a time you looked at a water supply coming into a city, and then it has worked its way through fairly the drain city, because you can't have a water supply strategy without having a drainage strategy. That means that because 100% of the water that comes into your house, the front door goes out the back door, and it has to be taken away and treated, and then you have to understand. Now, people will talk about natural gas and they talk about electricity, but they're natural resources that when they're used, they just go up in the air. But with drinking water, we take it out of a river, we pass it through, we actually clean it before we actually use it, then we dirty it again, then we actually have to clean it and put it back into the environment again. And probably in another country, not in Ireland, but in other countries, 5 miles downriver, they're taking it out to clean it again. So they are, to reuse. So water can be used many times. So that's how precious water is actually the thing. So what you then begin to look at is that there's floods, and then you have to look at the water cycle and the water sensitive city. Are we using water in the right manner? Should we be looking at it from many other aspects? And it gives you an idea then of the whole delivery functions as well of the water. So it does. So it gets your thinking has to cross over many boundaries and get it. And then a lot of you will have heard of the reasons for water restrictions and boiling water notice. And these are the main ones that you will see there. But you will notice that Cryptosporidium E. coli, Cryptosporidium and E. coli are the 3 main ones there that you would see. And they're the ones, okay, you have to get rid of, and just that's where the investment in the future will be as part of the thing as well. So what we have here is then the other side of the cycle, which is the wastewater, as I was saying there earlier on, that you have to actually then take it out. If it's industry nowadays, okay, we design a treatment works, and then you sort of say, no, hold on, we have a series of major industries. What we should do is get them to treat it on site, so that actually when it comes down to our treatment works, it's of a quality that 80% of what's coming in is of a same standard. The other issue is then the size of the treatment works, because in the older cities, in actual fact, the pipes were actually put in the ground initially to stop flooding, and then the foul was put into the stormwater. So what we've ended up with today is combined. And but since the 1950s, all sewer systems are separated. What that means is the rainwater has a separate pipe and the foul goes into a separate pipe. That means your treatment works can be reduced to about 1/3 the size, maybe, of what it should be, you know. And you don't have to cater for these surges then that come down in the rainstorms. And when you begin to look then, this is the way the Dublin system developed. You have the Liffey's was 1905. So it was, and what happened was all the sewers just went straight into the river, and you flushed it, hoped that the tide cleared it out, and that's why there would have been a smell in the river, so there would have. But then because the gravity, we tried to operate things on a gravity system, you can see as the city expanded out further and further, the sewer systems got bigger and bigger, so they did on the time. And then on the north side, you can see 1959. Then in the year 2000, we laid this one across here. Now, the sewers in 1958 actually went out here untreated, so the whole north side of the city went off Holt. So if you stood behind looking out at the back of the pier in Holt, there's a tunnel goes out under the sea, and it just all comes up there. And the sailing people would know very well what is the change in colour. And so the EU then brought in a legislation where we had to provide secondary treatment for over 10,000. So we then rebuilt totally Ringsend and laid a pipe under the sea to connect it, so we did. So this gives you an idea. Now this pipe is 11 kilometres long, it's 1.4 metres, so it's the same height as probably myself, and that was pulled in, assembled here, over here, and pulled in and connected up there. So it intercepted that and stopped it, and all the north side then will come across here and mix. And just to get so that gives you an idea of the extent of investment that you're now talking about for a large urban area, and it has to be, there's long-term planning involved. There was 700 wrecks sunk in that bay. When we were putting in that pipeline, we came across 3 of them, and people wanted us to take them up and preserve them. So what we did was we just moved the pipeline overnight and went about 30 metres away, and the dredgers then just dug a new trench, and we got on with it, you know, because, but that gives you an idea that the infrastructure is needed, but that doesn't make media news. It's the fact we might do a damage to a sunken wreck that you will hear more than anything. So when you're just going back to the drinking water as well, when you're actually looking at, people will always talk about leakage and all this type of effort as well. But when you're looking at the water, okay, we're looking at new sources, and there's no question. And you have, even with the new sources, you're looking at short-term and long-term, you know, and you have to bear that in mind, that every 50 years you need a major new source usually coming into a large urban area, and then you actually expand the contract or find ones in the interim. So you do. But, okay, we have to replace infrastructure. Then you have rehabilitation of the existing infrastructure. You know, leakage control. You have to have all these policies in place and get it down to acceptable levels. So you have, and people have to understand that. And if they're not going to pay for it, well, then you have to bring in the legislation to force people, actually, so you do. But this gives you an idea of the pipes in Dublin, 100 years, you know, that you're talking about, the corrosion and the cast iron. Okay, this is the rehabilitation. But we were looking for 20 million a year to actually be putting those in place. And that because we have 800 kilometres of it we have 80 kilometres of it about over 100 years old. And because people don't see it. Yet a person who had spent, I think, 2 million buying a house in the centre of Dublin, or in Dublin, rang me up and he said, do you realise how much I've spent in doing up my house? And I said, I'm sure you spent a lot. And he said, yeah. And he says, the water supply is absolute rubbish. And I said, have you dug your water pipe outside? He said, no. I said, well, that's down there over 100 years too. Would you mind having a look at it? And he came back and he said, actually, yeah, it's a lead supply. And I said, so you'll have a beautiful house, but you'll feel like poisoning your people, you know. But okay, he went and replaced the whole thing, and we had a discussion about it. But it had never crossed his mind to actually even look at the sewer pipes or look at the drinking water pipe, because everything was in what you see, so it was. So when you then come to look at new sources as well, people that sort of, this will give you an idea that when we were looking at the Shannon, all people heard was the Shannon maybe, you know, but we looked at actually 10 different options of where to go and how to look at things, what you would look at the short term, medium term and long term, and look at all the ideas. And what you see here about these lakes in the middle was an idea based on Rutland in England, in East Anglia, you know, where they actually dammed a valley at the time, and there was riots there in 1970 actually over it, but they had to pump the water from about 20 miles away because there wasn't a river in the valley to actually store it, to get water to the Milton Keynes and these places like that. So it was. So this was an idea where bogs have been excavated, that we would actually turn them into an amenity, as well as having a water supply area as well. And Irish Water now have this taken on board, and they're looking at Partine down here, and okay, I think they're sort of removing this option here. But it gives you an idea that when you go there and look at things, and people in Athlone at the time asked me to go down and talk to them, and I went down and met these people, and they said, look, you can't take water from Lough Ree, you know, you're going to dry it up and you're going to do this, that and the other thing. And I said, you know, okay, let's talk about it. And one person on the audience just said to me, look, it's been like this for 1,000 years, just leave it, you know. And I said, well, do you mind if we tease it out? And I said, well, you say it's been the same. I said, are we talking about the 50s or the 40s, or, you know, when there was no electricity and you went down to the bottom of the garden to go to the toilet and do all that? Is that the era we're talking about? Because I said in the 50s we exported about 80,000 people a year. And he said, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I said, we want all the amenities, but, you know, you just got... And I said, well, what exactly are we talking about? Because I said, it's not that I like coming down here telling you we'd like some water. And he says, no, you know what I mean, go someplace else. And this is the sort of, okay, I can appreciate where they're coming from, but we all have to come to it, because his best customers were Dublin people going down there to hire boats on the weekend, you know. So you have this contradiction at times and conflicts either. So that gives you an idea then of the treatment works there now. That gives you an aerial view of the treatment works in Ringsend. That treatment works in the year 2000, before we put in the secondary treatment, cost us $1 million to maintain. That treatment works today with secondary treatment and getting rid of the smells and doing everything else costs us $27 million a year to run. That's the cost of what you like in a modern day life. And that's the cost that people have to wake up to. That if you want certain standards, you've got to pay for it. It doesn't come cheap. That's why you end up with a blue flag over in Dollymount. So it is. Now, having said that, there's a lot of good comes out of it. We generated about 40% of our own electricity using the gas. So we did. When you take the solids out of the water, we actually cook it for about at 140 degrees for about 20 minutes, so it's pasteurized. And then it's thermally dried after that. There's bugs reintroduced, factory-developed bugs, and we then convert it into pellets, and then we can spread it on land. So we can. And it stopped all the dumping at sea. Now, the question you might ask yourself if you're thinking outside the box, if we pasteurized it so much and we send all this stuff to be spread on land, why don't we actually spread it on sea? Because now it's safe for the birds and the fish as well as for the land. But the EU people couldn't understand that, because they make a legislation for Europe. They actually don't realize that our solid waste maybe here in Dublin is, we don't have any heavy industry, so we don't have heavy metals, and we don't have any of these issues that you'd have on the continent. So and that was one of the problems we had with the pellets. As one guy says, you need a bit of dirt in it to actually get the pellets to stay together. But that's part of the thing. So it gives you an idea of the investment that's there. These were thermal dryers and that type of idea. So where do you go then in the future, the vulnerabilities and changing rainfall patterns and reduction and water charge? And then you look at this map, and it gives you an idea of, you know, of where the problems are. And you look at blue and you start to say, oh, there's little or no water scarcity. Nobody lives up here, folks, you know. So that gives you an idea. And then if you look at us over here, the problem. And the one issue, if you notice that, Northwest Europe is never going to have a water shortage. So it isn't. But what is going to happen is, if you take this area here, Bangladesh, for instance, right? Brahmaputra has 2 glaciers feeding into it. By 2050, those glaciers will have dried up. There's 200 million people living there, right? There's 60 million people in India taking water from wells, which has arsenic in it. where are those massive, when you think of mass migration which is occurring today, that's where people have got to start thinking. And that's where you begin to say, people look at our water supply and water from Shannon in today's context. But it's not today's context you must look at, because we're in a constantly moving world. Now the next part is, you then look at, they're talking about the change in temperatures between up to 2100. When you're talking about a scale like that, again, there's no definitive science. So you have to figure out, what exactly do we plan for? And this is an engineer's nightmare, because we like bans, limits. You know, are we going to have 10,000 people? You know, well, 900 could make a difference, you know, or something like that. So this is a nightmare, and that's where we've got to look at society, that the rules and all that have to change to cater for this. And then you look at the long term, you know, climate change versus society's needs. Society can only change at a certain pace. You can push change onto society, and then they kick back. So if you take during the Celtic Tiger, people might accept climate change and we should do things. When the recession kicks in, there's a different priority. And you've got to work with that means and try and find a way around it and educate people, so you do. Then you look at agriculture, the irrigation and crops. Well, if you take around the world that the world production of, say, wheat has been decreasing for the last 10 years, right? Now, say somebody in Ireland turns around and says, you know what, if we could get 2 crops here in Ireland, the price is going up like gold or something like that, but we can get it through irrigation. Then somebody who owns the water, how's the value of water? Because irrigation, if you look at any water-stressed country, irrigation is the major issue. We don't have a problem as long as it's consumption. Yes, so it is. So then you look at the migration, as I said there. Then you look at the seeding of clouds. That's accepted technology today, where you send up the planes, you get the rain to fall where you want it. You know, the Americans are doing it now. What's that impact? Could that have an impact on us into the future here in Ireland, the way the winds blow? So it could. Then the North Atlantic Drift, a degree or so of temperature, does that make a difference to what happens on land? And that sort of, and then desalination. Okay, there's environmental issues. At the moment, you can't really drink the desalinated water because but mix it. Now, they built a plant in Ashkelon in Israel, which they say you can drink, but I'll tell you, it's hard going. And this gives you an idea then of what happens in Vartry, down in the, you know, between a dry summer and a wet summer. So that, you know, it gives you an idea of how a reservoir can dry up fairly rapidly. This also gives you the other idea of the flash floods and how do we manage that, because if you're getting the flash floods, it's also running off a hell of a lot faster. 1,100 millimetres of rain falls in Ireland. 350 of that actually filters down into the aquifers. And that, so it gives you an idea of, you know, how do we actually get that? There's going to be far more rain in the west and northwest than in the east and southeast. So you're going to have problems there, so yeah. And then at the same time, just when you think you've just got a handle on things, somebody says, by the way, you do realize the seas are rising. So that means then you're going to get ingress of salt or whatever it is, maybe into aquifers and things like that. So and that gives you an idea of what's rising since the year 2000 that we've been watching here in Dublin. So it does. But then when you begin to look at the big thing, you see the water, how much water is going to fall. You look right up in the stratosphere on a global scale, then you come down onto a regional one, and then you translate that onto the land from what's happening up in the sky, and then you actually look at, well, what's my backyard going to be like and how do we get down there? And it's to put figures on that and get an understanding, so it is. And then you begin to look at Ireland. We're a spot on the map where we have this massive land thing here and we have this massive sea in front of us. And this sea is moving so fast across, it's reacting to weather in relation to the reflection from the Alps here or whatever it is, or other issues that are happening up in the stratosphere. So Ireland, in that actual fact, it just passes over and everything so fast. It is extremely difficult to predict what's happening. Sorry, this slide is a slight bit out of context, so I'll go on to this one. So when you go on to climate change then, there's 3 things you must do. One is the mitigation. We have to do it immediately, get in, is reducing the impact. At the same time, work with adaptation, change the way we do things, and try and gauge that rate of change. Then you have the resilience. And the resilience is the ability of a system of our organisation to withstand and recover from adversity. And if anybody wants to read the PIT report, it's a British government report. It's free on the web. You should read it. It's very, very good. It's in very good layman terms about floods I think it was 2007. And then the response. How can we respond? I think when you begin to see what happened in Athlone and things like that, you'd have to ask, were we organised, were we not? When you begin to look at what the Dutch do and all these people, they're far better organised in that sense. And resilience is really the part about it is because society has to adapt. How much, first of all, redundancy do we want to be built into the system so we can recover? Are we prepared to do without? Can you do without water for a few days? And things like that. Back in 1990, I remember a waterman went in the Wicklow Mountains, and I said, tell the people up in the hills there that, there's no water, and we'd try and get a tanker to them. So we went to the house, and the people said, don't worry, you'll have it back in a couple of days. People wouldn't accept that today. It's that type of idea. So you have that idea of the changing needs of society, and then, as we say, that you can reject. And then this gives you an idea of the threats that are there, the quality, pollution, the quantity available, sustainable resources, the EU role, and should we actually be arguing, because we're a very small country on the edge of the Atlantic and all that, different rules could necessarily apply to us. And then there's health and safety. Then you have the treatment works. We build treatment works on the sides of rivers, so we do. And what you've got to ask is, okay, is the backup there? But in actual fact, what I discovered in one case was the guy couldn't get from his house down to the treatment works because the roads were flooded. So what's the point of having everything done as a backup done when you actually can't get the person in there in the first place? And those type of things. And you've got to start looking at this bigger picture, which we're not used to, in a way. Then the arterial mains, as I say, redundancy, and then the reservoirs, the safety and treatment there as well. So it is. And then you have the other thing about the demand, the design, are people using enough, the water conservation, rainwater harvesting, the role of it, and, because that immediately introduces a health issue into your house. You're relying on the local authority at the moment to make sure the drinking water coming in is of a good quality and that the wastewater is taken away. The minute you introduce rainwater harvesting, that means you have to maintain the rainwater harvesting facility in your house. That sort of when it's recirculated and pumped, and are you prepared to do that? So you are, Water reuse then as well. Then the aquifer storage and recharging. One of the problems in this country about aquifers is that they're young aquifers, they fill too easily, but also they get polluted, and then the recharging of them when the water pricing. But this here I just put in as well just to show you about that the irrigation compared to other things, that it's the big user, and that's the one that you have to watch as well. And then, as I said, the butterflies, as they say, the concept, how do you cater for El Nino and all that type of effort? And you do that by risk assessment. But like when you look at risk assessment, most people take a dice like that, roll it, and say, right, what's the disk? But then there's Mother Nature, and maybe Mother Nature is using these type of dice. And that's where you've got to start doing your thinking and put it into context, so it is. And then just for today, just to give you an idea how a local thing can affect you. Here's a match against Spain some years back. Here's half time. Everybody going to the full time. People going to the toilets and turning on the kettle and putting everything like that. And yet you expect the system to be able to cater for that. So you begin to look at the macro right down to the micro and see how it affects you and the shootout and the penalty shootouts as well. And it brings it home that, you really have to appreciate water. It's a fantastic commodity, and it's essential for our existence, and we do need to appreciate it, no matter what the political scene is. Thank you very much.
Okay, suppose you were up in space and you were looking down on the Earth. What would you see? And what would you think about it? Let's see if we can. Can you hear that now? We'll see if it comes up. I'll see if I can get a bit more volume. One more line. From a distance, we all have enough and no one is in need. That's the view from space. If you look down in space and you look at all our water resources, that's the situation you would see. And if you put numbers on it and look at where all the water is, of course most of it is in the oceans. I think if I can get it, yeah, the oceans. 96% of the water, and it's of course salt, we can't do anything about it. But the rest of it, polar ice and snow is quite high, the rest of it is mostly in groundwater. Bit of a surprise to Irish people because that's not the case in Ireland. But globally, most of the fresh water, apart from polar ice and snow, that's available to us, about 30% of the freshwater resources of the world is in groundwater. And that's what the world has to live with. We're used to seeing lakes and rivers flowing over the surface of land and being able to see where it is and being able to get at it fairly easily and pollute it fairly easily as well. But that's not the situation worldwide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the rest of the world, not so much Ireland. If you look globally, there's a huge amount of water available there. It's also fairly well distributed among the continents. If you look at the numbers, forget about the individual numbers there, look at the last column. This is the amount of water for each continent per person in millions of litres per year. And if you take Damien doing his shower in the morning, there's more than enough in each, well, your shower actually would take about 0.2 of a million litres per year. There's certainly more than enough for Damien's shower every morning. However, there's a huge distribution and difference in distribution. Australia, per person, that's a combination of a large land area but a low population. And South America has a lot as well. But we're used to hearing about droughts in Africa. But huge numbers, certainly more than Europe per person. Asia, okay, is a bit of a problem. We don't hear too much about droughts in Asia. So if you look at the regional scale, forget about the global scale, you come down to the region, there doesn't seem to be a problem either. You have to go to lower scales and look at individual countries. And again, forget about the numbers here. The last one here is the amount of water available per person per year. Now this is not enough for Damien's shower in the morning. It's not enough to provide the normal amount of water that person in Dublin drinks per year. We need about 3 times that. So Afghanistan doesn't have enough to live the same lifestyle that we have. Also, Zimbabwe. But that rings a little bit of a bell. Zimbabwe was once known as the breadbasket of Africa. And yet their freshwater resource availability was very low, far lower than we would need per person. How did they do that? I'll go back to that in a minute. They did it by building dams and storing the water when there was a surplus. Because if you look at Irish rainfall, this is a comparison of the rainfall in Dublin over the year, the months, with the rainfall in the west of Ireland. And the rainfall in the west of Ireland depends where you are, of course, but roughly about twice the rainfall in Dublin. But in the summer, about the same amounts, or very little bit more. The west really gets a lot more water during the winter, the November, December, January, February. If you compare what Ethiopia gets, about the same amount of water actually as some places in the west of Ireland, but Ethiopia is a very dry place because it gets it in huge amounts of water over a short period of time. So the problem with water is not that we haven't enough of it globally, or even regionally, or perhaps even nationally, but it's very often in the wrong place, in the wrong amounts, at the wrong time. So we need engineering to do something about that. And this is the breadbasket of Africa, Zimbabwe. Look at the rainfall in Zimbabwe. All of it occurring in 3 or 4 months. This is the evaporation, the difference between, this is what the atmosphere takes, or tries to take, but of course it's not there. So how do we deal with it? If we allow our land to become denuded, there's no more grass to protect the surfaces, that amount of rainfall occurring over short periods of time will wash the soil away. And that's one of the ingredients, as well as water, for having a food supply. So we have to protect our soils. We also have to store the water in the periods, the short periods for which there's a lot of it around for use in the areas in which, or in the periods in which there isn't any available. This is what a Zimbabwean dam. They were well able to grow their food from irrigation from huge amounts of dams that they built. There are issues related to dams, I won't go into them. Transporting the water, Damien talked about that. The Nile, coming from the huge lakes in Africa, well, the part of it that comes from Lake Victoria, provides a source of water for irrigation, which we have to pump through canals and deliver to the fields in order to grow our food, in order to use that water. So we not only have to store it, we have to be able to deliver it. Part of that storage could be in the ground, in the spaces between soil particles in the ground. We still have to find where it is, but at least it's a bit safer from evaporation than the reservoirs that we might store the water in. In Africa, your reservoir might lose 3 to 4 meters of water during a summer. And that's a lot of water to lose from your reservoir. If it's in the ground, it's not. But when we use water, there are consequences. The Aral Sea, which is in sort of the central to East Asia, east of the Caspian Sea, is a sea fed mainly by 2 rivers, the Sir Daria and the Amu Daria, which comes down from the mountains in Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. That water in the 50s and 60s was diverted to grow cotton in the plains through which it flowed, and the result was a drying up of the lake. You might have seen it hit the newspapers about 15 years ago, but the lake, fed by the rivers, water that was no longer coming along because it was growing cotton, went like this. A couple of years it grew up because it increased because there were heavier rains or greater snowmelt in those eras. The sediments of the lakes with a lot of pesticides blew around the whole area, causing health hazards and diseases to the children in the area. But that was one of the consequences that are unintended from the use of water if we don't do it without actually taking care of the actual quantities that are available to replace our lakes. As well as the quantity, we're also interested in the quality. Again, this is Zimbabwe. This is Lake Macklewain, which provides the water, and this is the intake for the water supply for Harare. Now, Harare sewage treatment works did what Michael was talking about. It spread the sludge on the land, but without cooking it. And without being careful about the timing of the spreading. So a lot of the nutrients from the water supply being spread on the land got into the lake, water hyacinth grew, went into the water supply channel, and eventually blocked it. And unintended consequences of closing the cycle, putting our nutrients back on the land and allowing them to go into our lakes without taking care of the amounts that could be assimilated from the environment. There are other sources of contamination of water supply, particularly in Africa. This doesn't happen in Ireland, if I go back, but this is a forest road, and you can see the sediment being washed by rainfall into it. The amount of sediment collects in pools, and that gives you an idea of the amounts going into rivers. One of the other possible uses of water that we have to consider is use in growing food. Maybe in ways that were little used in the past, but the amount of food being grown through freshwater fisheries is increasing dramatically. So the amount of water that we're going to have to allocate to that particular use is going to have to increase. Where am I going? Yeah. Because of the need to provide food for the growing world population. The whole thing, as Michael said, is going to be affected by climate change. I won't go into the detail, but some of the things that we can expect are increased amounts of flooding. And flooding not just affects the developed world, but also the developing world. Maybe the houses are a bit easier to replace, etc., but the damage to crops and the pollution of wells and springs is even more I suppose, catastrophic to the individual because they have less resources to cater for it. One of the reasons that we have a lot of flooding in Ireland is that this is a very old map. You might remember seeing it. We did have a spatial plan at one stage. It was never followed to any great extent. But these were the red bits, the urban areas, the blue bits, the areas that they were expected to expand. But if you would superimpose on that a map of Irish rivers, you see why we have flooding in urban areas. Most of our urban areas, for very good other reasons, are built on rivers or riverbanks because it's a water supply, a method of transport, the fording of a river so you can charge people to cross, a lot of different reasons. So we are actually in the business of putting infrastructure in vulnerable areas for other equally good reasons, but we have to take account of it. So we have to be prepared for storms. We have technology that can see the rainfall coming in, say a radar picture of storms coming in Dublin, at least in Dublin, causing something like this. People come out to look at the floods, actually, and people build flood protection schemes. There's a huge program, the Sea France program, which you've probably heard of it, that's actually developing flood protection schemes for Ireland. And there are a lot of places like Kilkenny that are now protected, and quite a few places already, and a lot more that will be. But I'd like to draw your attention to a plaque. I don't know if anyone's ever noticed the Kilkenny scheme, flood protection scheme. There's a plaque here to a Harry Shine, BE, Bachelor of Engineering. Harry was an engineer in Kilkenny, and long before we had flood warning systems, Kilkenny flooded. But Harry realised that there was a small river upstream that was a steep, fast river, and it was when that river dumped its water quickly on top of the main flood in the main river that Kilkenny got flooded. So he put a little gauge up on that small river, and he was able to give the townspeople 3 to 4 hours warning, at least, that there was a flood coming. Long before we had electronic sort of telemetric ways of doing it. So our engineers were doing it because there was a need and there was a demand, and it was appreciated. That plaque is there for a reason. Nowadays we have electronic systems that can do it, and that can even include the uncertainty in the flood forecasts for warning for floods. We have to deal with climate change. One thing I'll just say about climate change, Michael gave me the details of the future projections of it. But have you ever asked yourself, or have you ever visited Skellig Michael and asked the tour guide, well, why did the monks leave Skellig Michael? The monks left Skellig Michael because the weather got stormier. It was getting harder and harder to land. Climate change. It's always been here. The wonder is that we didn't say, well, if the climate didn't change, would be more unexpected. The Annals of the Four Masters records that the coral, fed by this huge lake that goes through Galway, dried. And they found swords actually in the bed of the river. That the flood reached, I heard one person say that the foot of the high altar of Clonmacnoise, but I'm not sure of the foot of the high altar bit, but certainly the Abbey of Clonmacnoise. I looked at all the footage I could find of the December floods of last year, which are the largest on our sort of record since we started taking numbers. And there hasn't been anything approaching the high altar of Clonmacnoise yet. So climate change has always been there with us. And we've had far greater floods in the past than even we've had in the last couple of decades. So we have to live with it. We're going to have to live with it and not just say, well, it's never like that. If anyone says it was never like that, what they're really saying it was never like that in the last 10 years. 10, 20 years is about the length of where people remember the details. And that's the important thing. It probably has happened in the past, in a lot of cases. And we certainly haven't surpassed the type of climates that people living in the land in Ireland have had to put up with in the very distant past. Where are we going into the future? Well, there's been a lot of studies, and this is a study of studies. People have studied the Ireland, people have studied Spain, and in Europe, and basically there are patterns of where you expect the floods to increase, typically the west coast, and part of the Mediterranean area here, but in Eastern Europe, here, and in Russia they expect them to decrease. And that suggests a more global system. And there is some evidence that it's the track of the storms coming in from the Atlantic. That if they come down here, there's a lot of flooding here. If they go up here, there's a lot here. But this a lot less here. So there are patterns there that we're beginning to understand and actually become resilient to climate change. And maybe there, I thought I'd have to say something about paying for water, and maybe I shouldn't. But there was a conference. People old enough, my age, and we remember there was a conference in Dublin in 1991, the Dublin Conference, to produce a statement about water for the whole world, the World Water Statement, to go to the Rio climate change conference. And they thought, oops, oh, I've spoiled my, sorry, I spoiled my ending. Oops. There you go. Yeah, if you stay there, I'll go on from that, yeah. I'll go on from that. Just leave it there. Oh, yeah. And the Dublin Statement came up with 4 principles. But the last one of them was when water was recognised as an economic value in all its competing uses and should be recognised as an economic good. There was a hint there that we should be paying for it. Now, that was not accepted at the time. There was a lot of controversy about that statement. There was actually a lot of controversy about number 3 as well, but we won't go there. But there was a lot of controversy, and in fact that has been changed because the UN Economic Committee on Social and Cultural Rights now recognises water as a human right. So it's different. But the argument about paying for water has been raging for a long time globally. And there were various major world religions that had a big problem with defining water as an economic right because it was a gift from God. And that particular conference, I remember hearing about it at the time, that the way of getting everyone to agree was to agree that yes, it was a gift from God, you shouldn't be paying for the water, but you should be paying for its delivery. And maybe that's the key. But anyway, let me not go any further on that in case I get into trouble. Leave you with 2 thoughts. First of all, everything is connected. I'm sorry, I couldn't get a better slide to illustrate that than here. Everything is connected, from the research we do to the technology, etc., and the engineer, particularly the civil engineers in particular. That's my ad, if you like. And the last thing is, life must go on.
Mial, Damien and Michael, thank you very much for 3 quite different presentations, all of which add up to quite a picture about water. We're running slightly over, but then we started slightly late. So we're going to just have a couple of questions. Have we any questions for our 3 expert speakers? Yes?
I have a question.
There's two, yes. The man on the right with the, yep.
Yeah, I live in a hard water area where I'm fighting a constant low-level battle against limescale, which wreaks havoc on appliances and plumbing fittings. Have I any cause for optimism that softer water may be coming, whether I have to pay for it or not?
Can I just ask where you're living, because that might be relevant to the answer?
I'm in Ashbourne, County Meath.
Ashbourne, County Meath. Okay. Who's going? Michael?
Yeah. Okay. A lot depends on just the local authority in the area about the investment will be to soften the water. It is a major issue. Actually, the Martin water had the opposite situation. So if you lived in South Dublin in the 70s, you could expect to replace the cistern in your hot press about every 5 years, 6 years, because you wake up some morning and there'd be a pin hole, because it was so soft it was eating the copper in the hot press so far. And so now we put in a line-based plant, added line to it, and that sort of brought the pH back up to sort of neutral. But with the hard water, and that probably leaks it as well. Ballymore Eustace is fine, leaks it is hard because it passed over the next so it has. But it does mean that I wouldn't hold up any hopes for you in the sense that you will have to live with it. that they were shown there, the crypto solution and all these kind of issues to put the investment in rather than just to reduce the harms.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Yes?
I suppose in the light of the recent and ongoing controversy with water, I think a lot of that seems to me to be a lack of excellent presentations. That information is not out to the public. The concept of your water footprint. Everybody can know the carbon. What suggestions the panel have, would Engineers Ireland have, in educating the public.
Okay. Do you want to start with that, Damien? Thank you for the question.
I think one of the ways you got the carbon footprint across is when I look at my own family, it was done in primary school, and you have to start young and get people to realise the footprints are leaving behind. And I think looking at my own children going to school, they recycle to a huge degree, and I think if we can get that mindset going, so people can just see the various footprints, not just water and carbon.
Okay. Okay. Mial or Michael, okay on that?
The valuable suggestion, I mean, I would turn that back and say, well, you know, what do people think would be a good way of getting it out there? And certainly it is coming through, what Damien says, to the children, but there's a whole intermediate there. It would be very valuable to them in terms of conservation of water as well as just the practice.
Might I say that were it not for the controversy over charges, I don't think we would even today realise the value of water. And it's only when you have to pay for it that you realise it. And I think the great pity is that we are moving away from the conservation model of water, where you're incentivised, or where you were going to be incentivised for saving it, to the current situation, which is quite untenable environmentally. That it doesn't really matter how much of it you use. But I think there's a commission sitting, or going to sit shortly, that's going to come up with, I presume there are probably 3 wise men and 3 wise women, or hopefully a mixture of both, to come up with a way forward. And there's no doubt excessive use has got to be paid for, whatever about standard use. Any other question? Yes?
I have a question about solids drainage, sustainable urban drainage, green infrastructure, and I'm with the landscape department in UCD, and what is the real viability of that in, say, the Dublin area or Dublin region, using swales and...
Well, first of all, there is a drainage strategy which looks out to 2031, as you know, and part of that is an issue to do with urban drainage and the SUS principles and the way they should be implemented in the city. And that your garden, because the number of people who are putting in a block paving and things like that, by right you should have to get permission for that. And part of that was that there should be no additional water runoff. It should actually go into you should put in stone and allow filtration to the ground so that the ground can absorb a certain amount. In relation to swales and all those ideas, we started putting all those into the parks where we have the rivers and various other areas where, as well, to get the initial runoff from roads if we were near a water course area, so that the water, when it runs off, when the rain hits the road first, it takes all the sort of rubber stuff and all that and washes. And then we would have a little channel with the swales and the rhizomes and all that growing there that would actually absorb the water before it then flows into the main watershed. So we've been trying to implement that, in the city in quite a number of areas, and on even attached to say some golf courses that we try to get in the area that would blend in with actually amenity.
And is that successful so far?
It is what it is.
Maintenance, or
Sorry?
is there problems with maintenance, or is it?
No, in actual fact, no, we don't have a problem with maintenance, but it's still very much too small a scale to actually judge it. We need to move it on to a bigger scale, so we do, to actually, and to get people to appreciate it, exactly what's done. But in actual fact, the people who knew more about the wetlands and the swales and all that, in actual fact, were in the city. That surprised me, because people from down the country were actually asking our people to actually go down the country and explain it to them, because quite a number of the hotels in actual fact bought into them people, so that they could put their settlement.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Anything else? Yes? And then? Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. The man in the red first, then you next. Okay.
Just a question about water supply, and it probably brings in the comments of both gentlemen there. If you look at the patterns of precipitation that we get here in Ireland, they're mainly concentrated in the higher elevation areas due to the orographic nature of precipitation. And water quality as a result tends to be better in those locations. And in the ancient systems, like in the Hellenistic Greeks and Romans used, they tend to target water supply from those areas as opposed to from the rivers and lakes where water quality wasn't as good. And I know that the way we as a society tend to be sourcing our water tends to be from the more polluted areas, like the rivers where we have runoffs that are full of sediments and runoffs from land, let's say agricultural wastes and things like that. And I'm just wondering, has it ever been considered maybe that particularly in the Dublin area, but like another, some of the supplies are within the confines of the Wicklow Mountains, and I was just wondering, is future supply maybe, would it be better sourced there, especially given that it's nearer to where the population would be located?
Is your I'm not sure that we get your question.
Well, he's talking about that if we trap water in the upper catchments, which means build dams in the valley, and that in actual fact is the crux of the problem. You can imagine saying to people in the dam, I will last 3 minutes in the room. But the question does rise. I'll tell you where that question arose. It was very similar to the Turlock Hill concept of electricity, that a number of years ago, a man put forward this idea of down the country of damming valleys so that you could trap the water high up and get it flow down to generate renewable energy and
That's right.
actually then pump it back up, but we could also take off drinking water at the same time, so it could. But you can see that idea didn't progress very far, and that would in actual fact be hard. Now, to be fair, what has happened as well is that with the growth in population, and in actual fact, the invention of the railways, but in our case, the building of the motorways has created a great problem. Because it means people will travel to the amenities a lot quicker and faster, and as a result pollute. Because the fact that humans move into a lake area or move into anything that they think they're not doing much, the fact that we actually make our presence felt creates a pollution risk. And that is an issue. And we've got to try and take that water as it is. But we wouldn't be, like, the battery system is absolutely pure. There isn't even a septic tank actually in the area. You know, Ballymore Eustace is much the same, okay, and we've very strong planning restrictions. But to try and be allowed to build dams, it creates another environmental issue that's not acceptable.
Okay, thank you, Michael.
Just one more point, just
Yeah.
much smaller one. We did also serve to protect against flash flooding as well.
Well, yes, that is true.
Okay, all right. You're next, and then gentleman here.
Globally, are we losing water, or does the content remain the same? Is it going up or is it going down? Just interesting where we could become a dry plant. Good.
Yeah.
Globally, I mean, there's a very, very small amount, I suppose, of water vapor in the air being lost space, but apart from that, because the amounts being created in laboratories, etc., in experiments, it's small. We've got a finite resource, is essentially what it is. But if you think that, if you divide it into saline and non-saline, the balance between those is actually potentially changing. So, for instance, the freshwater resources in the ground, well, if you take the ones we can't use, the biggest freshwater resources are the Arctic ice and snow. Now, we're losing those to seawater, to the sea. So they're becoming saline. So the water is still there, but it's much more difficult for us to use. Eventually, maybe desalination will become practical, but not at the moment. It's too expensive, too energy intensive. For us, certainly, it's for rich countries at the moment. California, for instance, doing it, and Israel, as Michael said. So the balance between the freshwater and seawater distribution of it is actually changing. But also, even with the bits that we can use, the amount recharging groundwater is likely to change with climate change. If we get more rainfall and more intense storms, more of it's going to run off into the rivers and go quickly to the sea, and less will infiltrate into the ground. So even our freshwater resources that we would have fed wells, etc., and even the base flowing rivers, there's a potential for those to decline as well. But the water staying on the planet, it's just that it's probably more saline. Now, there's been a huge, globally, it's not in Ireland because planning is an issue in the developed world, but globally there's been a huge increase in the number of dams for hydropower, particularly in China, and flood protection and flood control globally. So that's holding back some of the fresh water, but that's evaporating back up into the atmosphere. But it's also impacting the amount of sediment going into the sea as well. That's sort of indirect consequences. But the likelihood of climate change is that that balance between fresh and salt will change, not that the total amount will change.
Interesting question. One more question. I just like to make the comment, Michael, about the water supply at Blessington. Blessington Lake, as I understand it, when it was flooded in 1942, it flooded 3 parishes. You can imagine wanting to flood 3 parishes now, you know?
Yeah, just one small point. I had visited the Coliseum myself a few years ago. I was interested to hear that the building that built it only got paid for the second part of it or whatever 40 years later. Certainly, someone that didn't hear about DBOs maybe 20 years ago, the Romans had the DBO running very well in that state, and no wonder it's still standing today.
Yeah, okay, Damien.
Yeah, well, I mean, you took a long-term perspective. I suppose if you were, I suppose the Roman equivalent of Michael Noonan probably had took a longer-term view, so he could, fund the current projects based on future pillage or future taxes.
Yeah, that would be small consolation to two people in the boat, wouldn't it? Can I just ask, has everybody paid their water charges? I would have expected people that would have an interest to come here might be in that category. Yeah. Okay. Not everybody put up their hand, mind you, but it's a free country. Just curious, and we're not recording it. Say, sorry, Michael. Well, it is not a free country. No, it's not. It certainly isn't free when it comes to water, and it's not free when it comes to waste either. Bin charges are becoming the new Irish water, I think, is it? So, okay, thank you all very much. I thought it was the most interesting debate. The world will see it because it's going on YouTube. So I hope you can all smile on the way out. And thank you very much, and thank UCD for arranging this event. And I want to thank Rebecca Patterson in particular and our 3 speakers.